Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you are watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. If you've never been here before, what we're going to do today is we're going to listen to some crackling fire and soft music, and mostly a story. This week we're continuing to read from Weird Tales of the Northern Seas, a Norwegian folktale collection by Jonas Lie. And the story we're reading this week is just called It's Me, in case you were wondering what that icon was about. You'll see why it's called It's Me when we read it, but I've sort of unofficially dubbed it the Giantess Who Ate Everything. Yeah, I think you'll see why. So if you've never been here before, this show is really best enjoyed as something humming in the background, or as you lie on a couch or make dinner, just to hear a story. And that's about all we're trying to accomplish. Nothing greater than that. GS is in the chat, says good evening. Good evening, GS. Pardon me. Early water. So just to reiterate, the last couple of weeks we've been reading from Jonas Lie's collection because I've really enjoyed it. This story is a little less dramatic than some of the ones we've read so far. It's more of a sort of moral tale, I guess, about a bit of a bully. The picture that you're seeing next to me, which I'm going to make big so that you guys can enjoy for a little bit. By the way, if you want to skip all of this and you're not watching it live, did it jump all the way to the end? That was silly. If you want to skip all of this and you're not watching it live, check down in the description below. There will be little timestamps. You can click. That'll take you right to the beginning of the story, and you can skip over all of this. But there's a bit of a drawing for you folks. Of course, it won't mean anything right now because we haven't gotten into the story, but it's from the story that we're about to read. All right. So, no reason to delay any longer. This is It's Me from Weird Tales from the Northern Seas by Jonas Lie. They had chatted so long about the lasses down in the valley, and what a fine time they had of it. There, Gigra's mother. Gigra is let me get the exact wording here, a giantess and the wife of the mountain gnome who rules in the Doverfeld. So an established character of lore. That's why there isn't much explanation of her. Gigra's daughter grew sick and tired of it all and began to heave rocks against the mountainside. She was bent upon taking service in the valley below, said she. Then go down to the ground gnome first, and grind thy nose down, and tidy thyself up a bit, and stick a comb in thy hair instead of an iron rake, said the dwellers in the mountains. So Gigra's daughter tramped along in the middle of the river till the foss steamed and the storm swirled about her. Down she went to the ground gnome and was scoured and scrubbed and combed out finely. One evening a large-limbed, coarse-grained wench stepped into the general dealer's kitchen and asked if she could be taken into his service. You must be a cook, then," said Madame. It seemed to her that the wench was one who would stir the porridge finely, and would make no bones about a little extra wood chopping and tub washing, so they took her on. She was a roughish colt, and her ways were roughish too. The first time she carried in a load of wood, she shoved so violently against the kitchen door that she burst its hinges. And however many times the carpenter might mend the door, it always remained hingeless, for she burst it open with her foot every time she brought in wood. When she washed up, too, heaps and heaps of pots and pans were piled up all higgledy-piggledy from meal to meal, so that kitchen shelves and tables could hold no more, and bustle about as she might, they never seemed to grow less. Can I just say, higgledy-piggledy is a a turn of phrase we need to bring back. It's great. Nor had her mistress, a much better opinion of her scouring, when Toad, for so they called her, set to work with the sand brush and scrubbed with all her might. The wooden, tin, and pewter vessels would no doubt have looked downright bonny if they hadn't broken to bits beneath her hands. And when her mistress tried to show her how it ought to be done, she only gasped and gaped. Such sets of cracked cups and such rows of chipped and handleless jugs and dishes had never before been seen in that kitchen. And then, too, she ate as much as all the other servants put together. So her mistress complained to her master and said that the sooner they were well quit of her, the better. Out into the kitchen went the general dealer straight away. He was quite red in the face and flung open the kitchen door until it creaked again. He would let her know, he said, that she was not there to only stand with her back to the fire and warm her dirty self. Now, when he saw the lazy, sluttish beast lounging over the kitchen bench and doing nothing but gape through the window panes at his boats, which lay down by the bridge laden with train oil, he was downright furious. "Pack yourself off this instant," said he. I should add, sluttish in modern context has a very different meaning. Well, not very different. A much more precise meaning. Here it just means slobbish, unkempt. But Toad showed her teeth. She grinned and blinked up at him and said that as master himself had come into the kitchen, he should see that she did not eat his bread for nothing. Then she slouched down to the boats and snorted back at him with her arm before her face. Before anyone could guess what she was after, she had one of the heavy hogsheads of train oil on her back. And back she came through the kitchen door, all smirking and smiling, and begged father to be so good as to tell her where she was to put it. He simply stood and gaped at her, such a thing he'd never seen before, and hogshead after hogshead she carried from the boat right up into the shop. The general dealer laughed, he was quite gasped for breath, and slapped his thighs so far as his big belly would let him reach. Nor was he sparing of compliments. And into the dwelling room he rushed almost as quickly as he'd rushed out of it. "Mother has no idea what a capital wench she's got," said he. But ever after that, she put her hand to nothing, nay, not so much as to drive a wooden peg into the wall, and if someone else hadn't warmed up a thing or two now and then, there would have been very little to eat in the house. It was as much as they could do to get her away from the fireside at mealtimes. When her mistress complained about it, her master said that she oughtn't to expect too much. The lass surely required a little rest now and then, and after carrying such drayman's loads as she did. But Toad always had an ogle and a grin ready at such times as the general dealer came through the door from the shop. Then she grew quick and lively enough and went on all sorts of errands, whether it was with the bucket to the spring or to the storehouse for the bread. And when she saw her mistress was out of the way, she took it upon herself to do exactly as she liked, both in this and in that. No sooner was the pot hung on the pot hook than she would slip away with a big saucer and fetch syrup from the shop, and she would flounce down before the porridge dish and gobble it to her heart's content. And if any of our fellow servants claimed an equal share, she would simply answer, "It's me." No sooner was the pot hung on the pot... They dared not rebel. Since the day she'd taken up the hogsheads of train oil, they knew she had master on her side. But her mistress was not slow to mark the diminishing both of the syrup pot and the powdered sugar, and she perceived also in which direction the gingerbreads and all the butter and bacon went. For out the wench would come, munching rye cakes and licking syrup from her fingers, and she grew as round and thick and fat as if she would burst, When her mistress took away and kept the key, Toad would poke her head into the parlor door and ogle and writhe at the general dealer and ask if there was anything to carry up to the storeroom. And then he would go to the window and watch her as she lifted and carried kegs of fish and casks of sugar and sacks of meal. He laughed till he coughed again, and wiping the sweat from his forehead, would bellow all over the place. "Can any one of my laboring men carry loads like Toad can?" And when her master came home dripping wet and benumbed with cold from his first autumn voyage, it was Toad who was first and foremost to meet him and unbutton his oilskin jacket for him and undo his sou'wester and help him off with his long sea boots. He shivered and shook, but she was not slow to wring out his wet stockings for him and fetch no end of birch bark and huge logs. Then she made up a regular bonfire in the fireplace and placed him cozily in the chimney corner. Madame came to give her husband some warm ale posset, but she was so annoyed to see the wench whisking and bustling about him that she went up into the parlor and howled with rage. Early in the morning, and the general dealer bawled and shouted downstairs for his long worsted stockings. They could hear that he was peevish and cross because he had to put on his sea jacket and cramped water boots and go out again in the foul weather. He tore open the kitchen door and asked them furiously how much longer they were going to keep him waiting. But now his mouth grew wide open as the doorway he stood in, and his face quite lit up with satisfaction. Round about the walls and in the warmth of the chimney corner hung his sou'wester and his oilskin jacket and his trousers and every blessed bit of clothes he was to put on, as dry as tinder. And in the middle of the kitchen bench he saw his large sea boots standing there, so snug and so nicely greased that the grease ran right down the shafts over the straps. Such a servant for looking after him and taking care of him he had not believed it possible to get for love or money, cried the general dealer. But now his wife could contain herself no longer. She showed him that the clothes were both scorched and burned, and that the whole of one side of the oilskin jacket was crumpled up with heat and cracked if one pulled it ever so lightly. And in she dragged the big butter keg, that he might see for himself how the wench had stuck his boots in it and used it to grease them with. But the general dealer stood there quite dumbfounded, and glanced now at the boots and now at the butter tub. He snapped his fingers, his face twitched, and then he began to wipe away tears. He hastened to go in that they might not see that he was weeping. "Mother does not know how kindly the wench has meant it all," he sobbed. "Good heavens, what if she had used butter for his boots? If she had only meant well, never would he turn such a lass out of his house." Then the wife gave up altogether, and let the big kitchen wench rule as she might. And it was not very long either before Toad let the key of the storeroom remain in the door from morn till eve. When anyone bawled out to her, "Who's inside there?" she would simply answer, "It's me." And she didn't budge from the gingerbread box, and she sat there and ate, even for Madame herself. But she always had an eye upon her master, the general dealer. But he only jested with her and asked her if she got food enough, and said that he was afraid he would one day find her starved to death. Towards Christmas time, when folks were making ready to go fishing, Madame was busy betimes and bustled about as usual, and got the great cauldron taken down into the working room for washing and wool stamping. The cooks hired for the occasion rolled out the lefser, which is thin cakes that can be doubled in two and eaten with syrup. Kind of a pancake thing. Baked and frizzled in the flat oven pans, and they brought in herring kegs from the shop, and meal and meat, both cured and fresh, and weighed and measured and laid in stores of provisions. But then it seemed to Toad as if she hadn't a moment's peace for prying into pots and pans. Her mistress was going backwards and forwards continually between the storeroom and pantry after meal or sugar or butter or syrup for the lefster. The storeroom door was ajar for her all day long, So at last, Toad grew downright wild. She was determined to put an end to all this racket, so she took it upon her to well smear the threshold of the storeroom with green soap. Next morning, her mistress came bustling along with butter and a wooden ladle and a bowl, and she slipped and fell in the opening between the stairs and the storehouse door. There she lay till Toad dragged her up. She carried her into her husband with such a crying and yelling that it was heard all over the depot. Madame had been regularly worrying herself to death with all this bustle, said she, and now the poor soul had fallen and broken her leg. But the one who cried the most, and didn't know what to do with himself when he heard such weeping and wailing over his wife, was the general dealer. None knew the real worth of that kitchen wench, said he. And so it was Toad who was now superintended everything, and both dispensed the stores and made provisions for the household. She drove all the hired cooks and pancake rollers out of the house. They were only eating her master out of house and home, she said. The lefts were laid together without any syrup between them, and she gave out fat instead of butter. She distributed it herself and packed it up in little nisbromsha, which are like packets for provisions, kind of like a longer lasting bento, if you know what that is. Never had the general dealer known the heavy household business disposed of so quickly as it was that year. He was quite astonished, and he was really dumbfounded when Toad took him up into the storeroom and showed how little had been consumed, and how the cured shoulders of mutton and hams hung down from the rafters in rows and rows. "So long as things went on as they're going now," said he, "she should have control of the household like mother herself." For his wife was now bedridden in her room upstairs. And at Yuletide, Toad baked and roasted and cut things down so finely that her fellow servants were almost driven to chew their wooden spoons and gnaw bones. But such fat calves, and such ribs of pork, and such lesser were filled with both syrup and butter, and such molje, and splendid fare for the guest that came to his house at Christmas time, the general dealer had never seen before. Then the general dealer took her by the arm, and right down into the shop they both went together. She might take what she would, said he, both of kirtles and neckerchiefs and other finery, so that she might dress and go in and out as if she was mother herself, and she might provide herself with beads and silk as much as she liked. There was nothing she might not have. Molje is flat cakes broken up with butter, by the way. But when the bailiff and the sexton sat at cards, Toad came in to lay the tablecloth, and they were like to have rolled off their chairs, such a sight they'd never seen before. Toad had rigged herself up with all manner of party-colored kerchiefs, and trimmed her hairy poll with blue and yellow and green ribbons till it looked like a cart horse's tail. But they said nothing for the sake of the general dealer, who thought she looked so smart, and was calling her in continually. And they were forced to confess that the wench spared neither meat nor ale nor brandy, and on the third evening, when they got so drunk that they lay there like logs, she carried them off to bed as if they were sucking babes. And so it went on, with feasting and entertaining, right up to the 20th day after Christmas and beyond it. And that wench Toad used to smirk and stare about the room. And whenever they didn't laugh or jest enough with her, she would plant herself right in the middle of the room and turn herself about in all her finery to attract notice and say, "It's me!" And when the guests left the house, they must needs admit that the general dealer was right when he said that such serving maids were not to be picked up every day. But those folks who went a fishing for the general dealer had their provisions put up for them beforehand, and were not slow to mark that Toad had control of the shops and the stores likewise. So it happened, as might only have been expected. Their provisions ran short, and they had to return home just as the cod was biting best. And while all the other fishermen sailed further out and made first-rate hauls, the general dealer was like to have apoplexy on the next day that he saw the boats lying empty by the bridge in the height of the fishing season. His men came up in a body to the shop, headed by their eldest foreman, and laid a complaint before him. The food that had been packed into their boxes and baskets, they said, couldn't be called human food at all. The lesser was so hard, they said, that it was munch all day. There was only rancid fat on them, with scarcely a glimpse of bacon, and as for the cured shoulders of mutton, one had scarcely shaved off a thin slice when one scraped against bare bone. Up into the storeroom went the general dealer like a shot. But as for Toad, she smote her hands above her head and said that it was as much as he, the general dealer, could manage to meet the heavy expenses for fish hooks and fish baskets and nets and lines without having to provide fishermen with salt herring and bacon and fresh butter and lefser and ground coffee into the bargain. They had no need to starve when they had all the fish of the sea right under their noses, said she. And then she handed him as a specimen one of his own lefser, which she had filled with butter and syrup herself, and let him taste it. And he tasted it, and ate till the syrup ran down the corners of his mouth. Such good greasy lefser he had never tasted before. Then the general dealer gave them a bit of his mind. He was as red as a turkey cock, and out of the shop door they went head first, some 3 yards and some 4, according as he got a good grip on them. And old Thor, who had steered the big fembering, both for him and his father, was discharged. But Kjell, the herdsman, had hid himself out of the way on the threshing floor whilst the row was going on, and the general dealer was shrieking and bellowing his worst in the yard below. And he stood there and peeped through the little window, and then he saw his mistress, who hadn't been out of bed for 9 weeks, hobble forward and stare out of her bedroom window. She looked on terribly, and cried and wrung her thin hands when she saw their old foreman told to go to the devil and shamble off with his cap in his hands as if he were deranged. But she dared not so much as shout a word of comfort after him, for there stood Toad, big and broad, in the storehouse door with a platter of mulje in her hand, and shook her fist after him. Then Kjell was like to have wept too. That stout Toad should not grease herself shiny with mulje fat much longer in their house, or he'd know the reason why, thought Kjell. Pardon me, water break. And from henceforth, Kjell kept a strict watch upon her. There were lots of things going on that he couldn't make out at all. Towards springtime, when they put the mast into the large new yacht, which was to take the first trading voyage to Bergen, the great general dealer was so glad that he was running up and down from the bridge to the house the whole day. He'd never imagined that the yacht would have turned out so fine and stately. And when they had the tackle and the shrouds all ready, they were hoisting away at the yards. He spun around on his heel, snapped his fingers. "That last Toad should go with him to Bergen," said he. "She had never seen the town, the poor thing. Well, as for mother, she's been there 3 times already." But it seemed to Kjell that he saw more in this than other people saw. As for Toad, when she heard she was to go to Bergen, she regularly turned the house upside down. There was nothing good enough for her in the whole shop. There was not a shelf that she didn't ransack to find the finery and frippery that glimmered most. And in the evening, when the others had lain them down to rest, she strolled over to the storehouse with a light. But Kjell, who was a very light sleeper, was up and after her in an instant, and peeped at her through the crack in the door. There he saw her cutting up the victuals and putting one titbit aside after the other, lefser and sweet cakes and bacon and collared beef into the large chest which she had hidden behind the herring barrels. And on this, the last evening before their departure for Bergen, she had filled her provision chest so full that she had to sit upon it with all her huge heavy weight to press it down. But the lock wouldn't catch. She had filled the chest too full, so she had to get up and stamp backwards on the lid till it regularly thundered. And sure enough, she forced it down at last. But the heel she stamped down upon it with was much more like the hoof of a horse than it was the foot of a human being, thought Chell. Then she carried the chest to the wagon, that it might be smuggled on board without anyone seeing it. After that, she went into the stable and unloosed the horse. Then there was a pretty to-do in the stable. The horse knew that there was witchcraft afoot and would not allow itself to be inspanned. Toad dragged, and the horse shied and kicked. At last the wench used her back legs just as the mare does. Such sport as that no human eye should have ever seen. And straight off to the general dealer rushed Chell, and got him to come out with him. There in the moonshine that wench Toad and the dun horse were flinging out at each other as if it were for a wager, so that their hoofs dashed against the framework of the stable door, and their long legs flew in turn over the stable walls, and the sparks scattered about in showers. Then the general dealer grew all of a shiver and staggered about. Blood flew from his nose, and Chell had to help him into the kitchen and duck his head in the sink. That night the general dealer didn't go to bed at all, but he walked up and down and stamped till the floor regularly thundered. And it was scarcely light next morning when he sent off Chell with $1 in his fist to old Thor the foreman, and he sent in the same way to all the boat people down by the shore. Thor was told to put on his holiday clothes and get out the fembering, again a boat, and row Madame herself to the yacht with the last lading. She would go with him to Bergen. There she should get both a silk dress and a shawl and a gold watch and a chain into the bargain, and engage a Bergen serving wench. It was still early in the day when the yacht lay in the bay with her flag flying all ready to start. And when they had hoisted the sail, that wench Toad, heavy and stout, came puffing and blowing across the bridge in full parade, with rings on all her sprawling fingers and her body covered with all the yellow and green and red ribbons she could possibly find room for on her ample person. And there she stood, waiting for them to come back in the stately fembering and take her on board. And when they began to raise the anchor, the general dealer appeared on the deck with his large Mersachum pipe and his telescope, and she smirked and minced and wriggled and twisted and cried aloud, "It's me!" She thought he wanted to peep at her splendor through his spyglass. All at once she saw Madame standing by his side in full traveling costume, and understood that they were going away without her. Then she kicked out so that the planks of the bridge groaned and creaked beneath her. 8 into the sea she plunged, and caught hold of the anchor, and tugged and held the ship back till the cable broke. Then head over heels she went with both her hoofs in the air. But the yacht glided away under full sail, and the general dealer stood there and laughed till he nearly fell overboard. The end. There's a lot to piece apart in that story. One thing I have always found interesting about how folktales go is there's this interesting play in folktales around things that look horrible are horrible inside, that like the outside is a reflection of the inside. So if something was quite handsome, that's because they were a good person, and if something was quite ugly, that's because they were a bad person. And I feel like this is an interesting story because it really plays with that notion in a way, in a more modern way, which is like, she's a terrible person in all her actions, but he doesn't believe it until he sees that she's half a beast and not fully human. And for that reason, it's interesting, if not obviously kind of weird and problematic, a viewpoint in the first place, but it is very in keeping with how most folktales put things together. Um, yeah, what I enjoyed probably personally the most as a modern reader of it was how well rendered this very specific type of person is. Because as I can see in the chat here, which I'll read out in a moment, most of us have met a person like that. I also particularly like the way that it looks at power structures, where she succeeds by flattering power, but never really has power herself exactly, except over those who have even less ability to flatter power. And ultimately, she justifies herself by being a very effective worker that saves her money. And I'm sure those are unintentional sort of elements of it, but they are interesting ones to me. Holly's House says, "Oh, this is a story about me." My lord, I hope not. I think that was said early on. GS says, "No, it's about me." Yeah, I don't think so, but maybe. I don't know. Then Holly's House. Oh, I see. Holly's House then says, "Actually, I think I've worked with this person. Haven't we all?" And yeah, there is GS. The moral is suck up to the boss. GS says, "I've certainly worked with that boss." Yeah. And Holly's House adds, "That's not just folk tales. Medieval and Victorian areas were heavy with the belief that deformed people or abnormal people were evil and punished by God." Yeah, and it goes back further than that to Friedrich Nietzsche, who, I'm sure you guys know, like maybe one or two quotes from. He had a book called Genealogy of Morals, and he does sort of the etymology of words there, talking about how they get used through different parts of history and Hebrew texts and Greek text and whatever else. But he points out that a lot of words that we associate with internal good moral character are rooted in words that would have implied you were a part of a sort of cultural elite. People that had, like there's this idea of sort of purity and cleanliness, right? Of character, that he was a pure soul or whatever else. Which, of course, is a reference to being clean. And, of course, people who had more ready access to sort of baths and more time to just sit around and wash themselves and never really got dirty in the first place were the higher ups, the pharaohs and their councils and whatever else. They were clean. And that eventually that sort of generalizes out into language about purity and cleanliness being sort of moral soul based existence. And he's making a case there that society has already been always been ordered around the elite or the good, because he was an elitist. But I don't agree with him on that point, but I think it's an interesting observation about how a lot of ideas that we in modern times would associate with internal character was for a long time in history associated to external traits for numerous reasons, and there's a lot of stories that play around with that. Like Beauty and the Beast is basically somebody playing around with what was a pretty established trope. If you met a beast in a castle, they're a wicked person. And it plays around with that idea that he's not really a truly wicked person. That was a French author, I forget his name, who did Beauty and the Beast. Anyways, this one was about, I just find it really interesting. What persuades him to see her terrible behavior is that she has hooved feet. Which is interesting because it really demonstrates what a terrible person he is, that he really only judges a person based on their appearance. Well, I realize this is earlier than we normally finish. I actually thought this story would go a lot longer, because it's actually quite a few pages, so maybe I just read quicker, or maybe my intro was short, but I don't have another story prepped. So it'll be a short one today. I guess that's good for people who want to go and get back to their dinners. Thank you so much for everybody who has dropped by. My name is Rory. This has been Fireside Fairytales. Please remember to like and subscribe if you like to do sillier things and actually be a part of writing a story, come back here Thursday at 6:30 for the Varietal Show, where we have more fun and it's a little more loose knit. Thank you so much for GS and Holly's house for keeping me company. I will keep the fire warm. Have a good night.